So the suburbs, man. These suburbs. I live in Chicago. There's outside Chicagoland. There's a place they call Chicagoland. What the hell is Chicagoland, man? Chicagoland is a lot of intrinsic suburbs, Cicero and you name it. It is the surrounding aspects of Chicago. Well, let's get a little bit of factoids about Chicago in conjunction with other cities right away. Chicago is considered the second biggest city in the United States. Now, that's not actually true. The reason why Chicago is kind of delineated to second city is because Chicago is not being counted by its outer boroughs. Okay, so I'll give you a good example of something. When they say they talk about L.A., Los Angeles, they include Orange County, and they just the whole thing is they include their surrounding boroughs. Okay, and they do this with New York as well. We got the 5 boroughs of New York, whatever. Chicago, they don't do that. They just pick Chicago, and then the Chicagoland areas around, they say, well, they're suburbs of Chicago. Okay, I'm going to bring this word up, suburbs, because it's very important between, this idea about gender equality. We'll return to that. But that's the reason why Chicago is actually considered the second. That's not true. Chicago, they say is the third, is smaller than L.A. Chicago really is the second city, so to speak, as far as the biggest cities in America, if you include Cicero and the surrounding suburbs, like they do in L.A. and New York. Okay. Our city officials know this. As a matter of fact, our aldermen have very strange districts. If you compare Chicago aldermen's district area compared to California's district areas and L.A. and New York, the district areas are strange. Chicago got strange district areas. They're not equal. And like I said, this goes back to the way Chicago is in conjunction with their surrounding suburbs, or what people like to call Chicagoland. Now, what's the thing with the suburbs, man? What's going on with the suburbs? Well, there is a dream that comes along with the creation of the suburbs. There's a dream. Okay. That dream is it is almost completely a male-driven dream. It's a dream created by males, and Caucasian males to boot. So, what's going on with 1950 suburbs? Why bring it up? And what does it have to do with 2019 and the way people live their lives in 2019? Well, there's a strange thing going on in the 1950 suburbs. Now, first of all, suburbs did not exist until around the 1950s. That alone sounds like a lie. I myself did not believe it until I went and checked it out. So before 1950s, what was going on? Well, you had the 1920s, you had the 1930s, but really, if you're on the boot of the 1940s, what's happening in the 1940s is World War II. Okay, and before the 1940s was a very dramatic period of American history where the Great Depression was having a heavy influence, a negative influence on American lives. Everybody was affected by just the phenomenal damage of the Great Depression in America. And this had to do a lot with the way people envision themselves, how their lifestyles would occur in the future. So what was going on here was that when World War II came about, they needed war machines. They needed jeeps and airplanes and what have you, and they made facilities that are still up to date. Where they were created corporations just for the war, to win the war. And what that did was create job opportunities during the end of the Great Depression for both men and women. You see Rosie the Riveter, that icon of the woman with her hand up like this, say, yes, we can. Okay, so that actually was true. It provided women a new sensibility, and gave them the opportunity to a lifestyle that they never had before. Yeah, that's what war did for women. They actually helped women in America. And so they were living, they were able to have opportunities they never had before. But they were still in a communal niche. Okay, so a lot of women were, some of them were doing man jobs, like riveting, themselves, or a lot of them were working a call, where you see them working a calls, basically, answering phones and doing communication jobs and secretarial jobs. Now, this actually continued into the 1950s, but something strange happened in the 1950s. Gee whiz, what happened in the 1950s? The birth of the suburbs. So, in the birth of the suburbs, what's going on? If you ever look at a Steven Spielberg movie, because Steven Spielberg, the director, great director, grew up. His lifestyle as a child, he grew up in the utopian dream of a suburban home, like you would see in the 1950s. And by all means, he got it right. Like if you see the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or you see E.T., look at the backdrops of those films, and you're going to see they actually personify the near perfect ideology of 1950s lifestyle in America. Even a movie that was not necessarily it was produced by Spielberg. What was it? Poltergeist, the first Poltergeist. There you go. You see these presentation and portrayal of 1950s America. Now, even though it might be 70s or 80s, whatever, they still maintain the facade of the 1950s lifestyle. In other words, that was the birth of the utopian suburban dream. So what was going on when, if I'm saying to you there were no such thing as suburbs until late 40s, 1950s, boy, that sounds like a lie. What was there before? Well, there was just rural America. There were cities in rural America. So you'd have one state. Each state would have one big city, and then they have a secondary city. Like in Illinois, you got Chicago. Then you have Aurora. And same thing for every state. And then, in conjunction with that, you would have some type of wide stretch farmland. And then from the farmland, as you get closer, you'd have what they call rural America. Now, rural America is the majority of America today. A lot of people who supported Trump and voted for Trump came from rural America. They didn't actually come from the suburbs like a lot of people think. Most Trump supporters came from rural America, from the rural America. In other words, out in the boondocks. So I'll give you an example. If you ever see, for instance, Bonnie and Clyde. You ever seen any movie with Bonnie and Clyde? You see Bonnie, they shoot up a bank, they jump in a car, man. And then they take off. They're like, where do they go? Well, how could they, Bonnie, Clyde will drive, 500 miles. What it is there's nothing in between those cities. There's nothing but small rural areas. And in the movie Bonnie and Clyde, you'll see this. You'll see them, passing by these very impoverished, small, little towns. Yeah, a bunch of little Mayberries. The birth of the suburbs doesn't occur until the 1950s. I kid you not. You know what I mean? And so in the 1950s has this kind of utopian dream. So people were out there and go, oh man, we can really own a house. So what they would do is start, they were working jobs in the city, and then, calling up developers. They were developing a commune, a community of many, many houses, and making these gigantic suburbs. And then they, hey, I can afford this home. And they were the first gated communities. They were the first communities that were gated. Gated loosely means exclusive. And that usually means people are kept out. Well, who are the people who are kept out? The undesirables are kept out. Who are the undesirables? The people who, in 1950s, they were usually the people who are not economically, who are not rich and white. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean people in the suburbs were rich. By all means, they were well off. They were above middle class, but they weren't phenomenally rich. They had to work for it. They earned a living, and they should be respected, at least for that part. I'll give you that much. So that utopian vision has some they actually have some admirable values. There's some traits in there that are actually very, very good for society, I believe. Positive, I mean. So, what happened? Well, one of the things that they did is they took the oppression of women. So in the 1930s and 1920s and all this, women's place, because that's what the video is about, women's place in the suburbs. That's what the topic is called, women's place in the suburbs. Okay, so what's going on is that woman's place, a woman's place, is romanticized in the 1950s. So back in the 20s and 30s and before that, you would have women just, they had to play the role. And that goes into a multicultural role. They have to fit these gender roles. And if you don't fit the expectation of that gender role, you're belittled and you're punished for not fitting that expectation. Now, the difference between the 1950s and the 1930s, 1920s, and early 1900s is that when women were neglected, it was done in a way where they kind of didn't care. They're like, well, that's your place, you go there. Now, the thing they did in the 1950s created the myth of the happy housewife. Now, some of the wives, I believe the majority of them were actually happy. I really do. But as time passed on, the happy housewife mythology started to crumple. They crumpled because, despite the fact that the 1950s did something that was novel, that was original, and that was to take the oppression of women, and decorate it in a nice way. So they would take the women's oppression and go, well, gee whiz, we're going to make sure you fit in a woman's place. You got to eat what we give you. In other words, you have to eat the very limited opportunities that we gave you. And boy, we expect you to be happy to it. So not only did they put women in the kitchen and said, oh, you're going to be the happy housewife, you better be happy with that role. Yeah, they were phenomenally successful at this. The utopian vision of the suburbs and putting a woman in their place was so successful that utopian vision went across every race and every creed all over the world and is the staple of what a man thinks their traditional relationship with a woman should be. Yeah. Okay, you don't believe me? Let's check it out. So I'm walking around Inglewood one day and I see a black guy friend of mine. He was an old graffiti artist and shit. So I'm talking to him and I asked him, just like I asked an Asian guy and a Latino guy, what their traditional values were for a man regarding his daughters and his wife, women, sisters. They amazingly, despite the fact there's no relation to them and they come from different cultural backgrounds, they have the same gender role specifics. The woman is in the kitchen raising the kids. The man is out there. The man is the head of the household. Okay. All right. So, nothing wrong with that. Okay. What's wrong with that? There is nothing wrong with that. I'm going to tell you there is nothing wrong with that. But there is something wrong by cutting off or limiting their opportunity. That's oppression and that's neglect. I'll give you an example now. I'm going to make it very clear. If the happy housewife says, hey, I want to go make a career for myself, and it goes out into the world and tries to create a career and tries to create a lifestyle, creates a living, and isn't able to do it because the utopian male dream inhibits it, that's evil. That's wrong. That's oppression. Did it happen? Millions of times. As a matter of fact, women are still fighting it in 2019. Far less, but it's still there. Let's get back to the 1950s, man. So after the World War, the whole freaking World War, women were actually quite empowered. Remember Rosie the Riveter? You can do it. We can do it. Women were empowered like they never were before in the history of the United States. So after World War II, they were just a wonderful gender equality. We went out there and we helped win this war, and by all means they did. A lot of them were nurses. Some were soldiers, believe it or not, and they were manufacturers of sometimes dangerous machinery, tanks and stuff that men were using in the field, guns and all these things. They were working in communications and all this stuff. So when women came right on the footholds of World War II, after World War II ended, they were in a place that was wonderful for women. They were in a place of woman empowerment because not only were they equal, they were able to live lives by themselves. Now, here's where it's going to get tricky, okay? People will try to contest me on this, but be careful. Listen to what I say. Check it out for yourself. So on the foot end of World War II, women did have an incredible amount of equal rights in the United States, but men were threatened by their power and equality. In other words, they had done the same jobs men did in many cases and were equally competent. Now this scared the utopian dream of men. So what had happened was they had to make up something that's going to put women back in their place. And they did something that was strangely almost admirable in its clever devious insidiousness. What they did is, the American male said, "Well, gee whiz, I got Rosie the Riveter over here who can do everything I can do, and I don't like it. I want them to be back in their place like it was in the 1930s, 1920s, 1940s. I want them back in their place." Okay, so you had all these misogynistic men who were all of a sudden afraid of women's inherent values, their competence, their individuality, and more importantly, their independence. So if you're one of these guys, one of these power holders, male power holders of CEOs of mega corporations and all these things, and you see this, it is a very fearful thing to see women and those in that age being independent and individualist, because it goes against the male dream. But they do something spectacular. They decorate oppression. Yeah, they take something that's bad and they decorate it so well and romanticize it, it looks good. So what did men do in the 1950s that changed the equilibrium between men and women? They actually made up the myth of the happy housewife. And guess what? It came in with some brand new invention. The suburbs. Yeah. So all of a sudden, there was not just a city in rural America. There was this gigantic, wonderful pit stop in between, where men could go work get a union job and go work in the city, and then come back to the suburbs and live with their own kind of people who had the same beliefs and same ideals, and make this wonderful utopian dream community. And believe me, they succeeded. They did it. But in total, what they did was they took the oppression of women and they decorated it to make it look like this is a wonderful thing to be a happy housewife. You come over here, we respect you, you raise the kids, you do this and that. That's fine. Remember, that's nothing bad. But what they did do was they cut off opportunity and limitation to women's careers and women's progression and social value. This is how they did it. They did it by decorating neglect and oppression and saying, well, gee whiz, you should be happy. Not only are we going to put you back in your place, we're going to make it so nice that you should be happy you're there. Yeah. And they succeeded. They won. So in other words, basically what happened was after women gained all the rights and all the competent independence they had, proving to themselves they could do everything that men can do, right after World War II, remember Rosie the Riveter? All of a sudden, Rosie the Riveter turned to Little Debbie Snack Cakes. Rosie the Riveter turned into, they took that image of her and they made her to some apron zombie sitting out there with a huge smile in the kitchen. You think I'm joking? Just look at some of the artwork from the 1950s. You're going to see just that. Okay? So what they did was start to establish a male-dominated community in that gated community of the suburbs. Remember, suburbs were wildly successful after that. And they also were so incredibly influential that even people who never stood one day in a suburb started to believe the utopian dream. So you had Latin men and Asian men and black men seeing the white man in the suburbs and going, gee whiz, that guy's living a great life. He's living a great life. And they wanted that. And what they did, even if they couldn't afford it, they try to make their own versions in an urban environment. They try to take the success that a white male had in 1950s America and try to reproduce that in their own impoverished area. It sounds funny, but this is actually what occurred. So why is that dangerous? Because what it did was that utopian male dream was so incredibly successful. It was incredibly successful at ripping away and tearing away the successes and progression made by feminine civil rights breakers and these kinds of things. People who progressed as just truly progressive, independent women who provided a pathway right out of World War II of individual, competent lifestyles for women. They completely and utterly debunked it. They stopped women in their tracks with this bizarre happy housewife, suburban, utopian male dream. And it was so incredibly successful that even males that have no racial or economic similarity to them desired it. Okay, This is the reason why when I talk to an Asian guy or a black guy or a Hispanic guy, they have the same typical common domestic notion for women, because they're basing their domestic notion for women on the 1950s utopian dream. So that's the man's ideal notion. I'm going to be head of the household, and she's going to do what I want her to do. She's going to fit in her niche. She's going to fit in a woman's place and do that. Some of the happy housewives, there is no myth. They truly are happy, and that was a great deal. But for a lot of them, it wasn't. How do we know this? Because there are plenty of women in the 1950s who went out, they were totally competent. They had come back from fantastically important jobs that they worked in World War II. And then, and with their qualifications from working in these fabulous, very valued jobs in World War II, and then try to make a living in the 1950s America. So you see a woman say, "Well, I'm gonna buy my own house in the suburbs, and I'm gonna raise my own kids in the suburbs, even if I don't have a man. I'm gonna go do it." It was almost impossible. And you say, why was that impossible? She was a foreman. She was a foreman for a tank manufacturing company in the 1940s, the late 1940s, and here we are 6 years later, and she can't even get a job as a secretary. Barely get a job as a secretary. That's the only job she could get, because the male misogynist machine changed their values. They're not gonna hire a woman because of her competence. They're gonna hire her only for those women jobs that they held in their own niche. It was complete neglect. But what they did was they took the oppression of women and peeled back all the great progression they made, all the work they did in the 1940s, and they succeeded. They destroyed women's independence and competence by spreading this crazy myth about the utopian suburban happy housewife. Okay? And it's so wildly successful that you could talk to a Mexican guy, and they'll be like, "Well, what do you want?" "Oh, I'm going to have my mother made tortillas in the back yard for my father, and my father made the money, and that's the way we live. That's our tradition, whatever. And also, I want to have my daughters and sisters live like that." Hey, bro, do you know where that came from? Do you know where that came from? Because I'm going to tell you something. You're going to think that that's how it was in Mexico. It wasn't. You see that shit in pictures. In Mexico, the housewife, yeah, she was making tortillas and all that in Mexico, but she was also working the field. She was also hitting the water. She was also selling stuff. A lot of Mexican women were vendors. They made the money. Yeah, in Mexico, in the 1800s, early 1900s, women were the primary. They were the breadwinners. What are you talking about? And the same thing with Black Americans. You know what I mean? Going to Black American, women are working on a way. It's the same story. So what is this head of the household crap? Where did it come from? It came from the suburbs, man. It came from the Anglo-Saxons' white American dream. And I'm going to tell you something. I can't stand that, bro. I can't stand saying this. It's not a white thing, because believe me, the guys in the suburbs, they rejected a lot of white people too. They rejected Jews. They rejected certain religious people who have different religious capacity. And if you were a white guy and you didn't have the amount of money they had, they outed you as well. You were an outcast as well. So not only they were going against blacks and Hispanics and Asians, they were also against regular good white folk. So I'm not gonna don't push your nose up to that either, because the utopian male dream is not a really white male dream, even though that's what actually occurred. It was just the idea that those males that believed in those certain domestic values, and they enforced them. So in other words, if the happy housewife wasn't happy, she was punished for it. You had everybody else saying, well, Marge doesn't do this, or Marge is not on the school, she's not on the PTA, and blah, blah. And believe me, if you ever go to YouTube and see how life in the 1950s was, you're going to see just that. Because I researched it. Every time a woman stepped out of her place, she was belittled or she was punished for it. How was she punished for it? Well, that doesn't mean they grabbed her and beat her in the backyard. It's not like you go to an Islamic country. You go to Islamic country and you'll see, incredible denigration of women. They can't even. They just got the right to drive, and they're being beaten in the street. You see a lot of Islamic and Muslim women in America go, hey, I don't have to wear a burqa, I don't have to wear that hijab or whatever. I'm probably saying that wrong, but yeah, you would if you were in Iraq. If you were in Iraq today, not even if you're there or Saudi Arabia, not only will they belittle you, they'll beat you, and if they they'll also imprison you. Try that over there and see what happens. And I'm not being an extremist on it. That's what I'm saying. So that's a nightmare. Now, the utopian dream in America, the only thing they have in common is they have the same ideal of oppression. But what Americans did was say, let's go trick. We're not going to force women to do that. Let's, what are we going to do to get all these beautiful, powerful, competent women and put them in their place? What are we going to do? Well, I'll tell you what, let's decorate it. Let's make it look so romantic and so nice that they'll fall in line themselves. And that is the myth of the happy housewife. And that's what it comes to when it comes to the idea of the suburbs and the idea of inequality in America and how that spread over cultures and races and economy to almost every male in America today. Think about it.